We are, can I start? Abigail, is it בסדר?
כן, את יכולה להתחיל.
Okay, good morning. Welcome to a new shiur for a new semester. What we're going to be doing in our weekly classes is really getting a weekly roundup of what's going on in the daf, in Daf Yomi. This shiur was inspired by the wonderful Siyum Hashas, which took place in January. It took place in Binyanei Ha'uma. Many of my students from Matan, from Pardes, from TVA were there. And really it energized it energized and inspired many women and men to start again, to either continue or to start learning Daf Yomi. And I thought it would be wonderful, since often I have taught over the last 2 years, I've been teaching Gemara, to do something a little different and to do a weekly summary of the Daf and highlight some of the interesting conversations going on the Daf. And that way, for people who are either learning daily or are not and want to have a sense of what's going on in Daf Yomi, that would give them a connection to this very enormous institution of study that's been going on for almost 100 years. 14 cycles of Daf Yomi have finished. We're up to the 15th. And it's really very exciting that around the world, men, young women are studying the same Daf of Gemara everywhere in the world. There's something very powerful about that. Today's Daf is 73, Ayin Gimel in Eruvin. We're actually going to go backwards and start from 65. We're in chapter 6 of Eruvin. And while Eruvin seems like a very dry tractate, it's a tractate that has to do with how to create boundaries that incorporate public and private, or semi-private and private spaces. Really within it are endless conversations about human relationships. And I think that's very appropriate and very reflective of a tractate that's trying to designate and delineate the boundaries between public space and private space. And really, that's a lot of the work we do in relationships as well. What are appropriate boundaries in a parent-child relationship, in a husband-wife relationship, in a Talmud-student relationship, a student-Rebbe relationship? And so it doesn't surprise me that in this tractate, I keep stumbling across questions about boundaries, not just within the technical platform of how to create an Eruv, but something much broader. And I'll be bringing you examples today throughout the shiur. Our shiur is 1 hour and 15 minutes. It's a relief because on Monday I do this in an hour, and the extra 15 minutes definitely gives me time to go a little more slowly and a little more expansively. So I would say buckle your seatbelts. You're in for a ride, meaning we're going to cover a lot of material. I'm going to use a little bit of text, sharing my screen, particularly for Mishnayot, and for if there are any diagrams that I think are helpful. But it's not helpful to bring you 8 pages of Gemara. It's just too much to use a text. If you have a Gemara, I can point out the page we're on and maybe you can find the citation, but largely we're going to be going through the material somewhat quickly. I will try to leave at the end a few minutes for questions. And if you have something, put it in the chat. Okay. That's by way of introduction. Very excited to be here. I really wish we could be in person because I see names on the screen that are familiar and beloved to me. And I wish I could see you and smile at you, but see my smile, I'm smiling at you, and very happy you're here. Chapter 6, just to throw out a few concepts for those who are new to Eruvin, or a review for those who are familiar already with Eruvin. This chapter is talking about what we call an Eruv Chatzerot. The idea, biblically, there are really 2 spaces and only 2 spaces to consider. Reshut HaYachid, private space. Reshut HaRabim, public space. And in order to be over on a D'oraita, to biblically transgress carrying on Shabbat, you have to carry or throw from private space to public space, or from public space to private space. And the definitions of those are actually very minimal. In other words, a Reshut HaYachid is something that's enclosed in partitions, has walls, is an enclosed space. A Reshut Harabim has to reach certain dimensions, 16 amot across, and some say it also has to have tremendous traffic, foot traffic or vehicle traffic for it to be a Reshut Harabim. So in order to biblically transgress, it's actually difficult because you'd have to move from, any of our streets around Matan would not be considered, most of them would not be considered a Reshut Harabim, and yet they're not really Reshut Hayachid either. So rabbinically, they added all sorts of semi-private spaces that are treated as public spaces. And one of the examples is a chatzer, right? The courtyard. I have many houses that exit into the courtyard. The courtyard is clearly not a Reshut Harabim, but what the rabbinic halacha demands is that the members of the chatzer, of the courtyard, all contribute some food item. They talk about bread, a roll, a piece of bread, to a specific corner of the courtyard in one of the homes. And that way they have created a communal and private communal space. Now, I just want to talk concept. That's what's called Eruv Chatzerot. In your Sidurim, whether it's Koren, whether it's Rinat Yisrael, there is always a bracha found in the section of brachot, the bracha you make on Eruv Chatzerot. We don't really do that anymore. We have a different model completely of Eruv. I'm not going to address the contemporary issues. Suffice to say, the Eruvim we have go around cities or go around communities. There are no Eruv Chatzerot, at least not in a yeshuv. Maybe in the Bukhari community they still do it. In Bukharim, in Mea Sharim, where they have the Chatzerot that the Gemara seems to be talking about. But the Eruv Chatzerot, to me, conceptually, is very, very important because it's reflective of these boundaries I talked about in relationships. In other words, the Chatzer, the courtyard that we all use, 10 neighbors exit onto the courtyard, belongs to each and every one of us, and we all treat it as if it's our private space. Except it's not really our exclusive private space. It's not our private backyard. And I feel conceptually the Eruv Chatzerot forces us to recognize that in order for us to really create a unified private space, we have to take everyone into consideration. And so in order for it to be a proper Reshut Hayachid on Shabbat, and there's so much to talk about of the day of Shabbat, Oneg Shabbat, and Shabbat is supposed to bring peace and rest and happiness, that we force these neighborhoods, these courtyards, to do a deliberate act in which they all contribute a piece of food. And of course, food is very unifying. It's where we all sit down and we can eat a meal together, and meals are where we create, we break boundaries and we create unity. You all have to bring a piece of bread into a home to show that we are all joining together on this day. So the boundaries that normally separate neighbors are being broken down in order to view the courtyard as my private space, but to recognize it's also your private space. And so I think there's something very beautiful conceptually in what is being asked of us practically. That's what's called an Eruv Chatzerot. Shitufei Mavo'ot, and we're gonna need to understand there's a distinction. A mavoy is an alleyway. So again, very similar to the Chatzer. The Chatzer is the courtyard, but I can have several courtyards that exit into a joint alleyway. Some alleyways have two exits, one on each side into public space, into the Reshut Harabim. Some dead end on one side and only exit on the other side. Nonetheless, biblically, this should be private space. This should be Reshut Hayachid. Rabbinically, we require an Eruv in order for all the members of the courtyard to carry in and out of the alley. So the alley, the mavoy, usually has more than one chatzer exiting onto it. And so they too have to join together into what's called a shituv mivo'ot. In addition, the mavoy has to be adjusted. It has to have a coat. It has to have some sort of beam on it or some sort of post in order to make it designated as a semi-private space instead of adjacent to a public space. But what I'm interested in is the shituf mivo'ot, which is where the members of the chatzer all contribute. Again, one of the things that'll come up in this week's daf, does each courtyard Every member of the courtyard also have to contribute to the mavoi. So if I have 10 neighbors in one courtyard, 10 neighbors in another, I have to bring 20 pieces of bread into the mavoi. No, the conclusion largely is the courtyard, once they've done an eruv, can then each send a representative, one piece of bread representing each courtyard. Okay, that's called shituf mavoot, and maybe we'll talk about it a little further along. Another interesting concept or important concept for this chapter is what's called bitul reshut. What happens if Shabbat starts and one of us forgot to join the eruv? If one member of the Chatzer forgets to join the eruv, it ruins it for everybody, right? It can ruin it for everyone, because now there are restrictions on who can join, who can carry, and where they can carry. And so really the law is everyone is now restricted from carrying into the courtyard. Oh, that's a terrible feeling, says Yaakov and Rachel. We forgot, we were so busy, we forgot to join the eruv, and now no one can carry in the courtyard. So Chazal, the rabbis, created a backdoor outlet for such a situation. Again, the interest seems to be unity, community, and we certainly don't want people resenting Yaakov and Rachel. And so what they can do is relinquish their rights, even on Shabbos. That's going to come up in this week as well. Can you do it on Shabbos or not? Beit Hillel says yes. I can relinquish my rights orally. I am mevatel, my rights to the Chatzer. I relinquish my rights to the Chatzer, and then I cannot carry in the Chatzer, but everyone else can. Okay, so it's a very important idea, this idea of bitul, because to me, again, it reestablishes equilibrium. It reestablishes the unity, the caring, the connection that neighbors have in a courtyard. And it allows someone who forgot or was inconsiderate to nonetheless remain part of the community by doing something deliberate that is considerate of the others in the community. And I want to remind us all that relationships between neighbors are complicated, right? I'm presenting this as if, oh, everyone joins the Erev Shabbos. The reality is some people forget, and some people, I don't need to carry in the Chatzer, so what do I need to make an effort for everyone else, right? We know those kind of people that are not interested in even going minimally out of the way to help everyone else. And the Gemara is very aware of that. What do I do if there's someone in the courtyard who deliberately doesn't join? Right? That's more complicated than someone who forgets to join. Someone who forgets to join, they can do bitul, but that has to be a deliberate relinquishing. I have to have the goodwill to relinquish my right to the Chatzer. If I am a nasty neighbor and I want to block everyone's enjoyment of the Chatzer, then I can deliberately not join, and then there's very little recourse. We're also going to see in this chapter, one of the first mishnahs we're going to see, what happens if a non-Jew lives with me in the courtyard, or a non-religious Jew, what they're going to call a mumar, who doesn't believe in Eruv, lives with me in the Chatzer. Bitul isn't going to work because relinquishing rights is a rabbinic concept. It doesn't really apply to non-Jews, and it doesn't apply to Jews who reject rabbinic Judaism. So those are more complexities that the Mishnah brings forward in terms of the relationships we have, the boundaries between people, between us and people who are drastically different than us. Are we going to be able to resolve any of that complexity with regard to carrying in the courtyard on Shabbat? And of course, that to me is a macro for, how do we resolve other issues that come up when we live with people who disagree with us or have different values than we do. Okay, so I think that's enough of an introduction. I want to get started with the first Mishnah, which I'm going to share. We're going to look about 4 or 5 Mishnahs throughout the day, but that at least will give us a text to ground us in. Hold on, I'm going to open up, not to the right. There we go. Let's hope the internet, here we go. Oh, almost there.
What chapter did you say you're in, Nechama? What page?
We're in chapter 6, and we're going to be starting on 65 on Daf Samech Hey, but this Mishnah is on 61b. So if you have a Gemara, you have a Schottenstein, you want to be following, I'm also putting it right here on the sharing my screen. Hadar im hanochri. So we're going to open up after that introduction with Hadar im hanochri bechatzer. So you live in a courtyard with a non-Jew. There are going to be all sorts of questions. Do Jews really live with non-Jews in courtyard? Don't non-Jews potentially want to kill Jews? How do we handle that? Are non-Jews afraid of Jews and so they don't kill them? And interesting questions come up about living with, or statements about living with Nochrim. But here we have a more practical concern. One who lives with a Nochri in the Chatzer. Oh, in mi she'eino moda be'eruv, harei ze oser alav divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says if you live with a non-Jew in the courtyard, you've got 10 Jews, one non-Jew, we all want to carry on Shabbat, we want to bring out the balls and the bats and the carriages and in and out and food and so on and so forth. That's what contributes to the avira, to the atmosphere of relaxation, of leisure on Shabbat, is being able to move in and out of the house and the courtyard, similar to the way we treat our backyards, perhaps. And you have a non-Jew in the courtyard, or you have a non-rabbinic Jew in the courtyard. That's going to restrict you, says Rabbi Meir. There's very little you can do. The non-religious Jew doesn't believe in Eruv. So what, you're going to let him do Beetle? He's never going to do it. He's not going to believe in it. He's going to think it's hocus pocus. The whole thing's ridiculous. The non-Jew can't be part of a rabbinic legal structure. Rabbi Meir says you're going to have a problem. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, La'olam eino oser ad sheyihu shnei Yisraelim osrim ze al ze. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says if it's one Jew and one non-Jew, or one Jew and several non-Jews, I'm not going to have a problem. I don't take the non-Jews into consideration unless I have at least 2 Jews sharing the courtyard. Then they restrict each other. Then I'm going to have a problem. Okay, we're going to move on. Amar Rabban Gamliel, ma'aseh b'tzduki achad shaya dar imanu b'mavoi b'Yerushalayim. So Rabban Gamliel says, I remember as a child growing up, and we had a Tzadukite. Now the Tzedukim rejected rabbinic Judaism. They had their own interpretation of Torah. And so they're an example of the Jew who doesn't believe in Eruv. And Rabban Gamliel's father said, Va'amar lanu Abba, maharu v'hotziu et kol ha'kelim l'mavui. So Rabban Gamliel's father had a solution. He would go to the Tzaduki before Shabbat and say, do you relinquish your rights to the Chatzah? And the Tzaduki would say, sure, okay, yeah, I don't really believe it. Fine, I'll do that for you. And then Rabban Gamliel said, quickly, as soon as Shabbat starts, start carrying in and out of the Mavoi. Here he's talking about the alleyway, not the Chatzah, but same idea. In the Mavoi, they share an alley. Start carrying in and out of the alleyway, so we assert our acceptance of his bitul. We accept our assertance that he relinquished his rights to the Mavoi before he can start carrying in and out and show us by his actions that he hasn't relinquished his rights. Okay, and so what Rabban Gamliel's father said is, if we get there first, then we essentially create a kind of chazaka. We accept his bitul, and even if he shows that he doesn't accept his bitul, he can't undo it. Once he's mevatel, that's it. We now show that we are using the chatzer, the mavoi, based on his relinquishing. And even if he comes after us and carries in and out and shows that he himself is kind of reneging, doesn't matter. Rabbi Yehuda, in contrast, said, "V'lashon acher, mi'aru v'asu tzarchehem b'mavoi ad shelo yotzi v'yasar lecha." Rabbi Yehuda says, no. If he starts carrying in and out of the alleyway, it's over. Because once he reneges on his bitul, the whole thing falls apart. So use it as quickly as possible. Take everything you need into the mavoi or out of the mavoi or whatever you need, so that he doesn't, once he comes out, he's going to restrict you. Okay, so 2 different approaches. This is specifically talking about a non-religious Jew, a non-rabbinic Jew, I would call him, because the Tzaddukites were religious in their own way, but they were non-rabbinic. And Rabban Gamliel's father basically comes up with the solution. If we use it first, accepting his bitul, then the bitul stands throughout Shabbat, because as Shabbat started, it was in place. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, once he reneges, it's over. The whole structure falls apart. Okay, and so that's the Mishnah. I'm just using the Mishnah as the starting point for some of the Gemara we're going to see until we get to the next Mishnah. Okay, we're going to pause for a moment, and now we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Gemara. Okay, so starting on 65. So we're going to see that we're actually deviating from the more conceptual, technical discussions of Eruv. Some of what comes up on these pages have to do with a disciple's relationship with his Rebbe, with his teacher, and whether a disciple is allowed to teach in the presence of his teacher, even if his teacher is not literally present. I'm going to say this because later on in the Gemara, we're going to have stories that I think connect to this idea. The Gemara says a disciple may not teach if his teacher is alive, if his teacher is present, if his teacher is in town, at the pain of death. And Rabbi Eliezer then tells a story of a disciple who taught in his presence, not literally, but with him in the area. And Rabbi Eliezer says to his wife, he's going to die. And in fact, a few days later, he dies. And his wife says to him, how did you know? And he says, I know, I have a Masorah. A disciple is not allowed to teach in front of his teacher. Now, I don't want to go into the stories. There are very brief stories that go on these pages of Gemara. The concept is very interesting to me because I've already told you that I'm interested in the relationships that emerge from these pages of Gemara, not just in this tractate, it happens throughout the Talmud. And this very tenuous relationship of the hierarchy between teacher and student, Rebbe and Talmud, professor and graduate student, are so relatable. Because initially, obviously, the sage, the Rebbe, the Rosh Yeshiva, when I first enter the academy, the yeshiva, the graduate program, the Rebbe knows far more than I do. And as a young student, as a new student, the hierarchy is very, very clear. But as the disciple gains knowledge and begins to interpret and interact with the material independently, what happens to the relationship? And so in order for Torah to flourish, I'll even use academia, science, and so on, we obviously need young disciples to throng, to flock to the study halls and study. But what happens in that space when the young student begins to overtake the older student? And the lens here in the Gemara has to do, of course, with Torah and with the not just scholarship, but the life experience, the magnitude of knowledge or life experience that the Rebbe has. But I'm going to leave open as a question, is it realistic to expect disciples not to teach Torah in the lifetime of their Rebbes? What will happen to Torah? We want our disciples to spread out, to go to lots of communities. They have to begin interpreting and answering questions on their own. And yet on these daf, there is definitely an anxiety about what's going to happen in that relationship when the young student begins to answer questions in the presence of the sage, of the Rebbe, of the teacher. Okay, 65 continues a discussion about wine. What is the effect wine has on our Torah, on our tefillah, on our learning Torah, on our prayer? What effect does wine have? And we're not surprised that there is a negative attitude or a concern for the negative influence that wine can have. And yet Rav Nachman says, and I'm on 65, but as I am going through it fairly quickly, so I'm not sure it helps to flip through the daf. Rav Nachman says, I actually cannot give a halachic ruling before having a glass of wine, because wine grounds me and focuses me, and I need it. And this is in the midst of statement after statement saying a person shouldn't daven when they've had a drink, they shouldn't when drunk. And this question, on one hand, by the way, they're drinking wine all the time, similar to beer in the Middle Ages, right? They don't drink water. They drink diluted wine. So on one hand, they drink wine regularly, like in France, right? That it's just a drink that is part of the culture and you drink with your meal. On the other hand, wine is not orange juice and it's not water and it has alcohol and it has potency. And so, this relationship with wine is very, very tense. Wine is mekadesh, right? We use it for kiddush. On the other hand, wine leads to drunkenness. And so what is a Torah scholar to do? What is a person getting up in the morning to daven do? And so they try to remove wine, and yet here comes Rav Nachman who says, no, I need to drink wine. It focuses me, it sharpens me. So now we need boundaries, we need nuance. How much wine and what kind of wine and how strong is the wine? We cannot remove wine completely. And yet we have to be very aware of the negative influence wine can have in our behavior. And so on 65, they have what I think is a very powerful passage. I'm on 65a, the top of the page. What they say is a person who is drunk. So again, this boundary between having a glass of wine and getting drunk. At what point does one glass of wine turn into drunkenness? That requires a lot of individual awareness, personal boundaries with alcohol. And they bring up a question, a braita. If I make a business transaction when I'm drunk, does it count? If I buy something when I'm drunk, if I sell something when I'm drunk, the Gemara asks, does it stand? What is my responsibility as a drunken person to my actions? If I commit a crime when drunk that makes me liable for capital punishment or for lashes, am I responsible? And the Gemara says, absolutely, you're responsible. It's a braita, it's a Tanaitic teaching. And then the Gemara does something astonishing. Unless you get as drunk as Lot. If you get as drunk as Lot, what I will use modern parlance, blackout drunk, that you don't know if your daughter lies down, when your daughter lies down with you and when she gets up from lying down with you. And the story with Lot is in next week's parsha, where after Sodom and Amorah are destroyed, the daughters with Lot flee to the mountains. When the daughters clearly think this is an end of life experience, this is an apocalypse, and the daughters think they are the only three left in the world, and the daughters do what Adam and Eve do in the aftermath of Eden and what Cain does after he murders Abel. They decide to regenerate, to repopulate the world, and the only man is their father. So as distorted as it is, it actually reflects this human instinct to bring life into the world after terrible destruction. But they also seem to recognize their father is not going to be a willing partner, nor do they want him to be, it seems. They just need his zera, his seed. And so they lie down with him. It's the story they don't teach in day school, by the way, certainly not in 5th grade or 4th grade when we learn Lech Lecha. They lie down with him and they get him so drunk that he doesn't know what's happening. And the Gemara says, if you're that drunk, you are actually absolved of responsibility. Maybe not for getting yourself that drunk, but for the responsibility of what you do when you're blackout drunk. And to me, that really becomes a very contemporary conversation. I'm not saying this in a judgmental way, but I'm saying it in a critical way. I'd like to make a distinction. What happens is on college campuses at times, where young men and women get so drunk that they're not aware of their actions. Now, if only one gets that drunk and the other doesn't, that's a lot of accountability on the part of the person who kind of knows what's going on. But you have two people who are not aware of what they're doing because they're so drunk. That becomes the very gray area the next day of who's responsible for violating whose consent. And I often use that to talk to my students, both male and female, about mindfulness with drinking. You can't tell them not to drink. They're drink. Just like in the Gemara, you can't say don't drink at all. On the other hand, you must be responsible and be aware of the potency of wine to put you into a space where you may not know what you're doing. And I'm not coming to judge. I'm coming to ask questions. And I was having a conversation about this the day before I got to this daf. I called my sister. I said, you're never going to believe this. The Gemara distinguishes between being drunk and being blackout drunk. And those are two very different spaces. Ultimately, you are responsible to recognize wine can bring you there, but it's a question whether you're legally responsible when you're there. Okay, so that is also going on in the daf. What also goes on 65 are things that distract us, and I love this, from davening with kavana. And so the examples that are brought are wine, food. Abaye says, when my nursemaid mother says, pass me the kutach. Kutach is bread with kind of a yogurt or sour cream. She wants the kutach. Abaye already is thinking about food. He can no longer focus on his davening. Other Amoraim talk about smells, the smell of beer, which has a very powerful smell, or the smell of fried fish, which, by the way, I think is probably a negative smell, right? Oh my God, I can't daven. All I'm smelling is the fish. Lice, bodily discomfort distracts us. Returning from a journey, 3 days after a journey, says the Gemara, you're probably not going to be able to daven with kavana. So these are very real reflections from the people who are the daveners, right? These are the sages who are so human. They are not superhuman. They cannot overcome bodily discomfort, smell distraction, visual distraction, and so on. And so awareness, right? Put myself in a space where I'm not going to be distracted. Now the Gemara moves on to two stories. I'm on 65b. Two stories. Can you lease rights from idolaters on Shabbat? I show up in a place, and now I'm actually going to show you a picture, so just to give you a little bit of something to look at. I'm not just talking, but you'll have to give me a moment, and I'll explain the story while I'm looking for the daf. It's all the way on 65. I show up in a chatzer, and I have an idolater living in the courtyard. I am going to an Airbnb. And in the Airbnb, we rent little rooms that exit into a courtyard. And one of the rooms is already being leased by the idolater, and he happens not to be home for Shabbos. And so what do I do? And so this involves someone no less than Reish Lakish, and they debate, can we go to the landlord? Because remember, the Nochri is a tenant, just like we're tenants. And could we ask the landlord who leased the apartment to lease it to us for Shabbat? And they don't know what to do. And they say, you know what? We're going to wait until, what should we do? And they decide to make a decision and only ask their elders later. I think it's Rav Acha. Anyway, what they lease it from the landlord, and after Shabbat, they go to their elder who says, Yafeh asita. So tying it back to what I told you, a disciple is not supposed to make a decision or a rule when his Rebbe is in town. And yet here we have a situation where the disciples are unsure and must make a decision, and they make a decision and only afterwards discover they did well. So, and in the second story, they go and Rabbi Yochanan is also asked, can we do some sort of leasing on Shabbos? The first story is before Shabbos. Can we lease from the landlord, not from the tenant? And they decide to do it. And their Rebbe says, you did well. Here we are. Okay, great. Here's my picture. I finally got to it, right? This is what's called an Airbnb. We have the pundak itself. This is where the landlord sits. I have a Jew renting here and a Jew renting here. And the tenant, the non-Jewish tenant, is over here. He's away for Shabbos. Can I go Friday afternoon and lease his house, even though it's already being rented, from the landlord? And they decide to do it and act first, ask later, right? Doesn't always work out, but this case it works out. In the second scenario, they show up, they don't have a landlord to ask, and the Nochri comes back on Shabbos, and they've been sitting in their houses, unable to bring their food into the courtyard and have a joint meal. They're limited. And the Nochri comes back on Shabbos, and well, can we get him to lease us his space on Shabbos? Is leasing like bitul or not? Or is leasing like a transaction? And they don't know what to do. And they say, you know what? Let's do it and ask later. Let's carry, let's find a way to carry, and we'll ask later. And they go to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Yafeh asita. So these two stories to me stand in contrast to the debate in 63, whether disciples can make rulings. Now, I'm sure there are those who will say, no, it's not the same situation, and that's this, and that's that. Nonetheless, what I see here are disciples only going afterwards to ask, making decisions in the moment, which we so often have to do. And perhaps what validates them is they go afterwards to check. But there's no question in the moment, they are relying on information. They are not even sure. They make a decision. They then go to their Rebbe. That's the way it has to work, meaning in real time, This is a real experience. Okay, we're moving on to 66. So I'm going to stop sharing. Let me just see if there's a picture I want in 66. Yes, not yet. No, 66. Yeah, I'm going to want something on 67, not on 66. Okay, so 66 has a poignant story that I think, as we age, we certainly can relate to. Rav Yosef, who is also blind, suffers from memory loss. And he's already older, and he questions Abaye whether he taught a teaching of Shmuel. He doesn't remember. And yet he's the one who is passing down Shmuel's teachings. But luckily he has a student, Abaye, who gently reminds him that he in fact taught Shmuel's teaching, right? And so I said, I'm always looking for the relationships. This sage, this brilliant sage who has overcome so many obstacles. He's blind, right? He doesn't even have a chiyuv to do a lot of mitzvot, not even to learn Torah. And yet he insists on having a place in the, not insists, his brilliance gives him a very significant and senior place in the academy. And at a certain point in his life, he suffers from terrible memory loss. And when he's taught something, or when he hears something, and it's in his name, in Shmuel's name, he actually has no memory that he taught that. What a bittersweet moment that on one hand, his teachings are continuing, but he's no longer able to remember that he taught that material. And Abaye reminds him that, yes, you did. You taught us that. You taught us what Shmuel said. You are an essential link in transmitting the teachings of Shmuel. And now I, your student, I'm going to remind you, and I'm going to consistently tell you that, yes, you are part of that chain of transmission. And what the teachings are, just to tell you, because I've already mentioned Shmuel, is it's about whether we have two courtyards, one next to another, lots of houses exiting each courtyard. I've already told you at the beginning that members of a courtyard can relinquish their rights to the courtyard. So again, if I have 10 families, Yaakov forgot to do his Eruv, and he can relinquish his rights to the courtyard. There's a question, if I have two courtyards adjacent to one another with a door, a fence open in between the two courtyards, and they both exit to the public space, they have separate exits. So they're independent courtyards, but they're also connected to one another. There's a machloket between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Can the members of one courtyard in unity relinquish their rights to the courtyard so that their neighboring courtyard can use their courtyard? We're going to see in a moment why that's relevant. Shmuel says no. Ein bitol me reshut l'reshut. Shmuel says no. One courtyard is independent. The other courtyard is independent. They can create an Eruv between the two spaces and join the two spaces. But if they forget to do that, then one courtyard cannot relinquish their rights in favor of the other. That's Shmuel's position. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Rav Yosef is the student of Shmuel who passes on this very important teaching of Shmuel. Ein bitol me reshut l'reshut. Furthermore, Shmuel also says, in the name of Rabbi Yosef teaches this as well, that if I have two houses with a ruin in between, a space that was once house, again, we can imagine this, two houses, in between them are the remnants of a house that once existed and a courtyard that once existed. Both houses exit into this ruined space. They both use this ruined space. On Shabbos, they can create an Eruv together to use the space. But Shmuel says if you forget to do the Eruv, because each house is its own independent entity, even though they both exit into the ruin, one cannot be mavatel their reshut for the other. You can't have one house saying, okay, I won't use the ruin this Shabbos, you can use it, it's your private space. Okay, so that's just some idea. I'm trying to remind you a little bit. We're in Eruvin. These are the kind of discussions that go on in Eruvin. And so Shmuel is very clear that independent spaces, courtyards, two houses that exit onto a ruin remain independent. They are not connected by a courtyard, and so they can't do bitol. And as I said, Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Okay, we're moving on to 67, And then we're going to look at a story with Rava and a baby and hot water where two courtyards are adjacent and one is going to relinquish their rights to another. And I'm going to use a visual so it'll be a little more helpful. Okay. The next story, and I'm going to share my screen because here we have a picture that might help us. First of all, there's a lovely, again, I'm always looking for the relationships. The introduction to this story is Rav Chisda trembling when he meets Rav Sheshet. And Rav Chisda trembles because Rashi tells us Rav Sheshet had such an enormous grasp of Mishnah that Rav Chisda, who's his contemporary, is afraid he's going to question him and that he's not going to be able to answer. He doesn't have the same memory and the same faculty for organizing material, right? So it's kind of interesting that Rav Chisda trembles when he would meet Rav Sheshet, and Rav Sheshet would equally tremble when he met Rav Chisda because Rav Chisda's powers of analysis exceeded Rav Sheshet's. So here, it's wonderful because even when we grow up and we take our place professionally, there are always those from whom we have a little bit of awe or maybe a lot of awe. And yet what we don't recognize is sometimes they're in awe of us as well, right? So Rav Chisda trembles when his lips trembled, says the Gemara, when he would meet Rav Sheshet, because of Rav Sheshet's enormous ability to organize the Mishnaic material. And it turns out Rav Sheshet would tremble like a leaf from the brilliant analysis of Rav Chisda. Beautiful. Okay, so the story that comes up here, and it's a complicated analysis, we're only going to look at the picture and talk about it because we're doing this roundup. Two houses on either side of Reshut HaRabim. You see that very clearly. Again, it's beautifully marked here. We've got the dotted line in the middle. This is my Reshut HaRabim, my public space. And I have two houses, one on either side. Each house, of course, is a Reshut HaYachid. Each house exits into their own courtyard, into their own backyard. And on Shabbos, a non-Jew gets up and creates boundaries on either side of the Reshut HaRabim and connects the two houses. So the question is, can now these two houses carry into this artificial courtyard that has been made for them? So this becomes a very complicated analysis. I'm only going to throw out the questions. The answer is ultimately going to be no. Well, before Shabbos, they didn't restrict each other because they had no shared space. And because they had no shared space, now that they have shared space, but it was only created on Shabbos, can they make an Eruv? Can they relinquish their space one to the other? The answer is going to be no. In other words, part of the problem is before Shabbos, they didn't restrict each other because they had no shared space. Now that they have shared space, they can't make an Eruv because it's Shabbos. So there's no way to do Bitul. Okay, that's essentially the answer. But I'm just showing you some of the way, in reality, a situation like this is unlikely to happen. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. And yet this is one of the ways we can expand boundaries of conversation around what shared space looks like before Shabbos, during Shabbos, after Shabbos, how we now create a boundary between two people on other sides of the Reshut HaRabim, completely unconnected, and yet I've talked a lot about conceptually. They are now connected. They now have a shared space where it seemed impossible and unlikely to have a shared space. And what do we do now? Can we create an Eruv on Shabbos? The answer is going to be no. Next Shabbos, they can do it if the municipality allows this to stay, right? This is ridiculous. Who's going to allow this? How many of us know of illegal structures which pop up, which end up impeding our right of passage, our ability to move around, right? And yet, until the municipality gets around with it, we have to deal with an ugly structure, an impediment to we have to go around it to get to where we want to go. Meaning these things do happen all the time. So it's not an impossibility that someone decides to create a yard in the middle of the Reshut HaRabim and say, look, my sister lives on the other side. Wouldn't it be great if we could pass one to the other? Oh, and the rest of you now have to go all the way around our houses. So I see this as actually likely, maybe not on Shabbos, maybe not building it on Shabbos, but certainly a likelihood. Okay. The next story I want to look at is the story of Rava, and here we also have a picture. Okay, this is the next story I want to talk about, and this will illustrate some of what I said before. I'm not going to talk about the camels right now. Camels are always interesting, but it's not a conversation I want to get into. Okay, this is Rava's house and his courtyard. Okay, here he is. This is another house with another courtyard. Notice that they have a shared entrance into one another's courtyards, and they exit into the Reshut Harabi. This is where Shmuel would say one courtyard cannot relinquish their rights to another because they're two separate entities. This is not the case of multiple houses exiting into a courtyard. This is two separate courtyards with an entrance that permits traffic in between the two. Okay, here's the story. Here's my case study. A baby is born in this house and he's circumcised on Shabbos. This is very typical. And the hot water that was going to be used to clean the baby after the circumcision has spilled. It is clear to me in this Gemara, they're not looking at Pikuach Nefesh. Later on in the Sechet Shabbos, they talk about the need for hot water to clean the incision, and it might be Pikuach Nefesh. But if you're thinking, wait, what about Pikuach Nefesh? The Gemara is not considering that. There's no risk to the baby. But it is preferable to wash the baby with warm water, hot water after the circumcision. Okay, so it's the 8th day, no hot water in this house. Rava has an enormous barrel of hot water in his yard. Guess what? Rava and the neighbor did not make an eruv. So they cannot carry from one courtyard, from one yard to the other. The question is, what is going to happen? So I'm already going to tell you, and this shouldn't surprise you, Rava simply relinquishes his rights to his chatzer. He moves all of his items into the back of the house. It turns out we get a little vignette. The men sleep in the front of the house. The women sleep in the back of the house. And Rava moves to the women's quarters in the back of the house so he not forget and carry his talis and tefillin into the courtyard. And now the members of this courtyard can go and carry water from the chavit, from the barrel, back to the baby's house. Okay, that's the solution. Lovely, visualized, and so on. What I want to talk about is that Abaye suddenly comes in and says, now, while this is a very nice picture, you have to imagine there are other houses in the courtyard. And Abaye comes in and says, wait a minute, why isn't there an eruv chatzerot? Why isn't there a shituf mavoyot? Because if there was a shituf into the mavoy, we could bring the hot water into the mavoy, and then the neighbors next door could come into the mavoy and take the hot water and so on. Why did Rava have to be mavatel? Isn't it likely that a sage like Rava would have created an eruv, either eruv chatzerot or shituf mavoot? And now this is, again, one of those little nuggets about relationships. Abaye says, it's obvious to me that Rava, the Rosh Yeshiva, is not going to go collect rolls from the other members of the courtyard. It's undignified, it's unseemly, and he's a busy man. So I understand why Rava didn't do it. But you might ask, why didn't I, Abaye, do it? I'm not as great as Rava. And so I had the time, and it's not undignified for me. And Abaye now says something so heartbreaking. And it really, to me, points a finger at all of us to think about who our neighbors are. Abaye says as follows: the rest of my neighbors don't care. They're not going to bother. They won't carry, they won't carry. They're not going to make Erev Shabbos running around. They're not going to worry about the Erev Chatzos. I, a disciple, a sage, remember. The problem is as follows. If I now, Erev Shabbos, just put out a loaf of bread, because I can do that. I can put out a loaf of bread for my 7 neighbors, 7 slices of bread in the loaf, and I'm now giving them each as a gift a slice of bread, which now belongs to each of them, and I'm using that as my Eruv Chatzeros for everybody. I could do that, because to go around and collect from all 7 neighbors, it's time consuming, no one's home, they don't have a slice of bread. I could just do it. And you might say to me, so Abaye, why not just do it? Take a loaf of bread, cut it into 7 slices, each slice for each member of the Chatzer. And Abaye now says, The problem is, they theoretically can now come to me and say, give me my slice of Abaye. I want to have my slice of bread that you put aside for me. Thank you very much. An extra slice of bread on Shabbos. I'll put a little peanut butter on it. I'll have a shalom shudis. Very nice. And Abaye says, I am so poor that this is my loaf for the week. And if they come and demand what is rightfully theirs in order for it to be an actual Eruv Chatzerot, I won't have what to eat during the week. And it's heartbreaking to me, right? That Abaye can't afford to give 7 slices of bread. He has the indifference of the neighbors, his very busy Rosh Yeshiva, right? Who legitimately doesn't have time for the Eruv Chatzeros. Abaye remembers, but can't financially afford to put out the 7 slices of bread on the off chance that the neighbors start coming to him and saying, oh, thanks for doing that. And you know what? An extra slice of bread, we'll each can drink. Wow. What a indictment of a society, of a chatzer that isn't aware, the members that don't care about Eruv, or maybe Rava, who's his Rosh Yeshiva. How can you not know that there's an Abaye who cares about the halacha, but can't afford to put out 7 slices of bread? And that brings me back to the opening of Masechet Shabbos, where they talk about the ani, the poor man in the Reshut Harabim, the Baal Habayit in the Reshut HaYachid, the homeowner is in the private space, the ani's in the public space. To me, that already puts the burden on us. Where are our aniyim? Are they stuck out in the public space? And now, oh, it's Shabbos, I can't give you a piece of bread. I can't pass you anything. Am I inviting the ani into my house? Or am I sitting there starting to, well, I can't give you any bread on Shabbos because it's over a doraita, right? The Masechet opens up deliberately with the relationship between the poor man and the Reshut Harabim and the Baal Habayit and the Reshut HaYachid. And where are our poor people? And here too, I feel like when Abaye says this, I as the reader cringe a little bit and say, how am I not aware, if I live in a chatzer with Abaye, how am I not aware of my responsibility to make sure he has enough bread to eat, that I don't take from his bread? Okay, and so we're moving on. Again, a story that's very, very small in the Gemara that to me already opens up a lens to something much, much bigger about boundaries, about relationships, and about the relationship between neighbors in a courtyard, and sometimes our indifference or our inability to really know what's going on in the house next door. Okay. What comes up on the next page, because the Gemara continues to talk about the baby and the hot water, and can you ask a non-Jew if the hot water spills to heat up water? Well, Rava says only if there's pikuach nefesh. And the baby apparently is not pikuach nefesh. Now, in this story, Rava doesn't have any hot water, no hot water for the baby. And what Rava says is, but you have the birthing mother in the room with the baby. The birthing mother, 8 days later, is still a chola who could have sakana. There could be danger if the mother doesn't wash with hot water. So his students come back to him and say, but Rava, she's eating dates. She's sitting up in bed. We see her. She's well enough to eat some dates. She's not really that sick. And Rava, and I love this again, because Rava says, what, you're bringing me reality? I don't really get, maybe she's crazy. A stupor overtook her. They call it tunba. She has tunba. Birthing women 8 days later don't normally eat dates. They're not well enough. Dates are harder to digest. Let the goy heat up hot water for her. So this is so Talmudic and so halachic. It's where the student comes and says, this birthing woman is well. You don't need to heat hot water. And Rava says, you know what? I don't care. All birthing women 8 days later are still in a category of some danger. Let him heat up the hot water. Let's not look at the one crazy exception. The rule is this, and then you can bathe the baby. So again, it's a wonderful reflection of what is the way halachic process often works, sometimes to our advantage, and we love it, and we say, wow, that's really amazing. Sometimes it can be very frustrating when the halacha does not reflect the reality of the individual, but there's this uniformity that kind of closes off the individual from the actual experience that halacha is saying they're having. So that comes up a lot in Nida, actually. Okay, we're going to move on. So now we're up to 69, moving right along. Can you undo your bitul? What happens if I give a bitul? I say, okay, I forgot to do an eruv on the batel. Can you undo it? I already said that at the beginning of the shir. I asked that question. And we saw with the Tzaduki that Rabban Gamliel's father said, as long as you use the Chatzer first and create a chazaka that you accepted his bitul, he can transgress, but he can't undo his bitul. And Rabbi Yehuda says he can undo his bitul if he does it deliberately. Okay, and so that becomes a machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir says, and Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Gamliel's father, Rabbi Meir says, even if you do it accidentally, if you start using your chatzer after you relinquished your rights, you ruin the whole thing, the whole structure collapses. Rabbi Yehuda says only if you do it deliberately, the whole structure collapses. And we see that Rabban Gamliel's father, in contrast, says, no. Only if you didn't use it yet does the whole structure collapses. Once you use it, you reassert the bitul. Okay. Daf 70. I really want to make sure to get up to 72 and 73 because we're going to go back to parent-child relationships, but we have 20 minutes, so hang in there. I hope you're still with me. I know it's a lot of material to be absorbing. Inherited rights. Does someone relinquish? I'm sorry. If someone dies on Shabbos, someone who forgot to join, who was Mavatel, someone who is Mavatel, or someone who joined the Eruv, and they die on Shabbos, and their son, who happens to be in the house, automatically inherits their father's house and their father's courtyard. The question that comes up is the son acquiring the rights of the father, which is a form of acquisition, and it can't be done on Shabbos? And so the son does not replace the father and cannot actively do either bitul or eruv because Shabbos has started. Or, and I love this one, the son essentially steps into his father's shoes. It's not just that he's acquiring his inheritance. He essentially becomes his father in his father's place. And that to me speaks so powerfully of the sense of continuity when a parent dies, please God, b'seva tova, right, in old age, and leaves behind children and grandchildren. This sense that their presence is still there, that there's an automatic, not even just continuation, that the child becomes the parent, comes up on this daf, even legally. Do we look at the son as stepping into his father's shoes? And I think when we have a yortzeit, when we think of our dear loved ones, a lot of times we talk about continuity, the sense of comfort that the parent left behind, right? The child who looks like the parent, who acts like the parent, who takes over the parent's business, and so on. It's not just about acquiring inheritance rights. Unfortunately, those questions are often those that lead to rupture in the family. Who gets what? Who acquired what? But on a larger scale, the comfort comes from the stepping into the parent's shoes, the replacing, the continuity, not just replacing, but essentially seamlessly continuing the father's name, the father's line. And so that becomes a halachic question. How do we look at it? It's going to be a machloket, right? Of course, it always is. And Beit Hillel seems to say we would look at the father as the son is automatically essentially becoming the father in a very powerful way and also in a legal way. And so if the father was either Mavatel or participated in the Eruv, the house and the Chatzer continue that legacy rather than a new owner stepping in and not being able to continue the Eruv or the Bitul. Okay, the next, the last two, we're up to two more Mishnahs. We're beginning to wind down a little bit. We're going to look at them so you have a text to look at. We're going to look at the Mishnah, and that way we'll be able to talk about it. I'm going to skip down. Okay. Here we go. Bal habayit shaya shutaf l'shchenim. So now we have a question about a bal habayit who has a home, two neighbors, one on either side. They share a courtyard, and the guy in the middle has a partnership on either side with his neighbors. L'zebayayin v'l'zebayayin. He has a partnership in wine or with wine on one side, and on the other side also with wine. Einam tzrichim la'arev. We said part of the motivation, rabbinic motivation for Eruv Chatzerot is to create a unity, a sense of fraternity, a sense of oneness between the members. That's what the Eruv Chatzerot is, right? We all join together in this loaf of bread that we're going to eat at some point, or symbolically eat. And here the Balabayit already has wine that he shares with his neighbor, either in business or personally, right? It seems to be in business. And so already there's a partnership. You don't need an Eruv then. If there are partnerships between members of the household, that stands in lieu of the Eruv. Lezeba yayin v'lezeba shemen. What if on one side it's wine and one side he's in a partnership with oil? Tzrichim la'arev. The Tanna Kama says, no, you need an Eruv. That's not similar enough. When everyone is in wine, then that creates a commonality and everyone's in partnership in wine. And that's like they're one big loving family around wine, which you shouldn't drink when you daven and teach Torah. Okay. Rabbi Shimon Omer, achad zeh ve'achad zeh einam tzrichim la'arev. Rabbi Shimon looks at it much more conceptually. It's really the same entity. What do I care? Wine here, oil here. The partnerships, the concept of partnership between neighbors is what's relevant here. So Rabbanan say wine and oil are separate entities. You got to have an Eruv. They're not in unity. And Rabbi Shimon says, I don't care about the quality, oil, wine. I care about quantity in a way. The act of sharing, the act of partnering is what's enough. Okay, and so that's what's happening in this Mishnah. What happens a little bit later in the daf, what happens if I made a shituf in the mavoi and didn't make an eruv? The answer is a shituf is enough. You don't need a shituf in an eruv. Okay, so again, interesting question. What trumps what? What's more important than what? But largely a shituf in the mavoi, a shituf, if all of the chatzerot join together to make a shituf, to make essentially an eruv in the mavoi, in the alleyway, they don't need individual eruvim in their chatzer, and everyone can carry in and out freely. Okay. Rabbi Meir now says, what I want to highlight here is what Rabbi Meir says. If you start allowing these kind of, not just leniencies, you override eruv chatzerot, what are the children going to see? What are the children going to know? Rabbi Meir shouts out, if you start voiding one in favor of the other, the children are going to grow up never seeing an eruv chatzerot. What is going to be? What is going to be with the future if the children never see the full picture? What about the children? And so what the Gemara concludes is the halacha seems to be a shituf is enough. You don't need eruv chatzerot, but many communities acted according to the custom of Rabbi Meir. I love that. Again, how are we going to educate? Do we just want virtual conversations that we never apply? Or do we want to illustrate to the children, even though it's not always necessary, right? Eruv chatzerot and shituf mavoi. Even though for many people, efficiency, I need to be quick, I need to be efficient. It's much more efficient for all of us to just join in the mavoi and permit the chatzer and not start worrying about eruv chatzerot. And Rabbi Meir says, but what if a child never sees an eruv chatzerot? Okay, so I'm going to leave that as a question. We've now moved on. We're on 72. Chamesh chaburot, and then Chamesh chaburot sheshaftu b'traklin echad. Beit Shammai omrim eruv l'chol chabura v'chabura. Beit Hillel omrim eruv echad l'kulan. Umodim b'zman shemiktzatan shuriyim b'chadarim or ba'aliyot shehen tzrichin eruv l'chol chabura v'chabura. You have 5 companies. Again, imagine we all go to an Airbnb, an enormous Airbnb. That's really one large room that's divided by partitions. And there's a courtyard that exits from each of the partitions into the courtyard. Beit Shammai says everyone needs to make their own eruv. We need an eruv chatzerot from each company. Beit Hillel says no, it's enough. Everyone's really in the same room. The partitions are just temporary. They're dividers. And one eruv is enough in the chatzer. They all join together. One eruv is enough. Umodim bizman shemiktzatan. Now, if they're really in rooms, everyone's in closed rooms or in upper stories, then everyone needs to make their own eruv. Okay, and so that's a machloket Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. The first reading is talking about one mansion and what types of partitions to the wall, halfway to the wall, and so on. The second reading is much better because this doesn't really make sense. If we're all in a space for Shabbos, then we should be able to use the chatzah. It's definitely a reshut hayachid. But what if I want to make an eruv with the chatzar next door? Then the question is, does each company have to bring their own piece of bread, or is it enough for one company to bring a piece of bread for everybody? And we end up deciding that really what we're talking about is a a mansion with a second chatzer, a traklin and a second chatzer, and that's really, so ignore the first reading, everybody. I read the Mishnah according to the first reading. I'm explaining the Mishnah according to what seems to be the more practical application, which is this mansion with 5 different families, all in clearly separate companies, and another chatzer that they want access to. Then really you only need one Eruv according to Beit Hillel. According to Beit Shammai, each family has to bring their own contribution to the Eruv with the chatzer next door. Okay. The last Mishnah I want to talk about brings us back to family. My guess is for some of you, this is going to be very recognizable. We have an enormous courtyard. We have lots of children, brothers. It's going to talk about sons in this case, who are partners. They all are good friends and partners. They all eat at dad's house. No meals at home. Wives don't seem to cook. They all go to dad's house regularly, certainly on Shabbos, and they sleep at home. Right? The best of all worlds, if you want, right? The parents have the nachas of having the children and grandchildren around the table. They all go home to sleep. The question is, do they need an Eruv l'kol echad ve'echad? Does each brother need a Eruv in the courtyard, given that they eat, or is it enough for their father to make an Eruv? The Tanakama says they each need an Eruv because they're sleeping at home, and that's what we're going to talk about. Where is home? Is it where we sleep, or is it where we eat? By the way, Hanukkah candles, Shabbos candles. Shabbos candles are about where we eat. Hanukkah candles are about where we sleep, right? So what if one of them forgets to join the Eruv? He has to relinquish his rights to the Chatzer, and then it's okay. Ematai, bizman shemolichin eruvan b'makom acher. Abal im haya eruv ba'etzlan o she'eni mahen diurim b'chatzer inan shechem mave. Now the Seifa of the Mishnah says as follows. You actually only need to do an Eruv if there are non-family members in the Chatzer. If everyone in the Chatzer is a family member, the father and the sons, then you don't need an Eruv. That's ridiculous. They're already one family. If there are non-family members, then you need an Eruv, which I believe would mean actually daughters and sons-in-law, right? Because that's not the same relationship, but okay. And this only applies, let's say all the brothers and father are in one courtyard, where we want to use another courtyard, we need to do an Eruv Chatzerot. Again, one of us will bring an Eruv. And then the Gemara talks about what happens if we all go, if the Eruv is in dad's house, then even if there are non-family members in the courtyard, we don't need to contribute. And the Shulchan Aruch actually says if it's in one of the brothers' houses, the other brothers don't need to contribute because they're in partnership with one another, right? There's not just a family connection, there's a partnership connection. The Gemara then asks, what is a dira? What is a residence? Rav says where you eat. Shmuel says where you sleep. Again, I think we can all relate to this. The Gemara then says, what if a man has 5 wives in 5 houses in the Chatzer? Right? What if he has 5 wives? They don't get along well enough to live in one mansion, or it's just more convenient to have 5 houses. Is one Eruv enough? Is his Eruv enough? Or do they each need to do an Eruv? The Gemara says, what about 5 servants in 5 residences? 5 avadim. There's a machloket. One of the Rabbi Yehudas, Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. One says wives are really extensions of their husband. The other says, no way. Wives are independent. It's servants who are extensions of their master. And so they have a machloket. Again, the machloket's interesting. Again, what is our relationship to our spouse? Is it as a dependent? Is it as an equal? In the Mishnah, we have children, grown children, who are still dependent on their father for sustenance or choose to be dependent, and yet they have their own homes. Here we have wives who live separately, and yet is there a dependence on their spouse? Are the servants dependent on their master for sustenance and so on? Very interesting questions. And Rambam, Maimonides, comes in and says servants and wives can both rely on the husband/master's Eruv. And Rambam just cuts through the whole thing and says, no, there's a link, there's a relationship, and they can be inclusive. And the Gemara the last piece, which is already on 73, is what about a Rebbe Talmud? What about Talmidim, students? Here we're back to the Rebbe Talmud relationship, which is really where we started. The Rebbe Talmud relationship, Rav remembers eating in Rav Chia's house, and he remembers he relied on Rav Chia's eruv, and slept in the base medrash. Rav Chia ate in Rebbe's house, right? He ate in his and relied on Rebbe's eruv. So here we see that the Rebbe-Talmud relationship is similar to the son-father relationship, right? That there's at times the relationship, the dependence, particularly for food, can create a combining of space, so that even though I sleep in another space, I essentially, where I eat, particularly a Rebbe, a spouse, a husband, is greater than where I sleep. And so, as I said, these questions come up, Hanukkah candles, Shabbos candles, right? There are differences in how we view the need of the candle and the role the candle plays. Here we have a question about who makes the eruv. Is it the one who is supporting everyone with food, or is it the dependent, or is it where you sleep, and so on. And so we're going to close here. I have like 3 minutes. I'll check and see if anyone has any questions. But we've gone through 8 daf. I just want to acknowledge that was an enormous amount of Gemara we just went through. I know it was very frontal. I hope that nonetheless it was engaging. I tried to bring in some pictures, but I hope you also realize even in this very dry, what is often perceived as a very dry tractate, for good reason, a lot of calculations and geometry and math and so on, there are these wonderful reflections on the boundaries within relationships. And I think that's something we can all relate to, and we all struggle with as we move through different phases, from daughter to mother to grandmother to spouse to student teacher, teacher student, and so on. We're constantly wondering and questioning the different boundaries we have in our lives. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
תודה רבה נחמה, תודה לכולם. השיעור הבא מתחיל ב-11:45 עם יעל ליבוביץ'.
Yeah, Nechama, can you repeat what you